For decades, Saddam Hussein ruled with fear. But now, the man who once stood untouchable was locked in a small, guarded cell. Cameras would capture Faribam every moment. Millions would watch as Iraq's dictator faced the same fate he had given so many. At exactly 6:05 a.m. on December 30th, 2006, the trapdoor would open, and the world would witness history. For almost 24 years, Saddam Hussein controlled Iraq in a way that left no room for opposition. From the moment he took power on July 16, 1979, his presence was impossible to escape. His portraits hung in classrooms, offices, and streets. His speeches filled the airwaves. People were taught to praise him. Many were too afraid not to. Under his rule, anyone who spoke against him risked prison, torture, or death. Families of those accused could also be punished. Entire households disappeared without a trace. No one asked questions. Questions were dangerous. He had survived wars with neighboring countries. He crushed uprisings within Iraq's borders. He endured years of strict economic sanctions from the outside world. His security forces remained loyal. His network of spies reached into every neighborhood, every office, every school. To many Iraqis, the idea of him being overthrown seemed impossible. He had lasted through the Iran-Iraq War. He had held on to power after the Gulf War. He controlled the military. He controlled the media. He controlled daily life. But in 2003, everything changed. The United States and its allies invaded Iraq in March 2003. The accusations were clear. Saddam was hiding dangerous weapons and supporting terrorism. The invasion was swift and relentless. American warplanes pounded Iraqi defenses from the sky. Missiles lit up the night over Baghdad. The sound of explosions became constant. Iraqi forces tried to fight back, but they were no match for the overwhelming firepower. City after city fell. The Iraqi military had been weakened by years of sanctions. Equipment was outdated. Supply lines were fragile. Troops were spread thin across the country. As coalition forces advanced, resistance crumbled. By early April, the road to the capital was open. On April 9, 2003, American tanks rolled into Baghdad. The streets filled with chaos. Some people hid in fear. Others came out to watch history unfold in real time. That same day, in Firdos Square, one of the most symbolic moments of the entire war took place. U.S. troops, helped by cheering Iraqis, pulled down a massive statue of Saddam. The statue had towered over the city for years. Now its face crashed to the ground. Crowds surrounded the fallen monument. Some stomped on it. Others hit it with shoes, which is a deep sign of disrespect in the Arab world. The image spread across every news channel on the planet. Within days, Saddam's powerful government collapsed completely. The ministries stood empty. Soldiers deserted their posts. Looters tore through government buildings, taking anything they could carry. Files were scattered. Records were burned. The structure that had held Iraq together for more than 2 decades simply fell apart. And Saddam himself, he vanished. The man who had ruled Iraq for more than 2 decades disappeared into the shadows. No one knew where he had gone. Some thought he had fled the country. Others believed he was hiding somewhere in Iraq, waiting for a chance to return. But the Americans were determined to find him. For months, Saddam Hussein was nowhere to be found. The U.S. military poured enormous resources into locating him. They launched one of the biggest manhunts the world had ever seen. The operation was called Red Dawn, named after a 1984 movie about a surprise attack on America. But this was no small mission. Thousands of troops were involved. Helicopters buzzed overhead day and night. Armored vehicles rumbled through villages and towns. Intelligence teams worked around the clock, analyzing every piece of information that came in. Every possible lead was chased down. If someone whispered that Saddam had been seen in a village, soldiers arrived within hours. If a safe house was suspected, It was raided immediately. Nothing was ignored. His closest aides became the first targets, then his relatives, then his bodyguards. One by one, they were tracked down, arrested, and interrogated. Each capture brought the Americans one step closer. U.S. soldiers even carried a special deck of cards. Each card had a photo of one of the most wanted figures from Saddam's regime. At the top of that deck, representing the highest value, was Saddam himself. He was the ace of spades, the card everyone wanted to hold. As the months passed, Saddam's world shrank. The hiding places grew fewer. The people he could trust became harder to find. The Americans kept pressing harder. They searched the deserts. They combed through farms. They questioned anyone who might know something. They studied his habits. They analyzed his past. They tried to think like him. Where would a man like Saddam seek shelter? Who would still protect him, even now? By late 2003, the trail led them to a rural area close to his hometown of Tikrit. This was a place where Saddam still had loyal supporters. Families who remembered when he was just another young man from the region, before he became a dictator. On the night of December 13, 2003, soldiers from the 4th Infantry Division and U.S. Special Forces closed in on a small farmhouse in the village of Ad-Dor. The area was quiet. Date palm groves surrounded the property. Farmland stretched in every direction. During the search, they discovered something strange. A patch of dirt covered with debris, branches, clothes, random objects that didn't belong. When they cleared it away, they found a narrow opening. It was a spider hole. A tiny underground space, barely big enough for a person to lie in. The entrance was disguised, hidden, easy to miss if you weren't looking carefully. Inside, they found Saddam Hussein. He looked nothing like the man who once ruled Iraq with an iron grip. His beard was long and messy. His hair was untrimmed. His clothes were worn and dirty. He appeared thin, tired, and aged far beyond his years. He had a pistol beside him. But he made no attempt to fight, no attempt to resist. Instead, he was pulled out into the light, blinking, disoriented. After months of hiding underground, the brightness must have been overwhelming. The hunt was over. For many Iraqis, this was a moment they thought would never come. The man who had seemed untouchable for so long was now in custody. But capturing him was only the beginning. After the capture, Saddam was kept under strict U.S. guard for more than 2 years. He was moved between secure locations, always watched, always under tight security. The Americans knew that if his supporters found out where he was being held, they might try to free him. So they kept him moving. Never in one place for too long. Never told exactly where he would be next. Finally, on October 19, 2005, his trial began in Baghdad. The court faced an impossible task. Saddam was accused of countless crimes, killings, massacres, acts of torture that had gone on for decades. There were too many to address in a single trial, too many victims, too many incidents. The judges made a decision. They would focus on one event, one case that had strong evidence and many living witnesses who could testify. They chose the Dujail massacre of 1982. The story of Dujail began on a hot day in July 1982. Saddam Hussein's convoy was moving along the main road, passing through a quiet farming town about 50 miles north of Baghdad. The town was called Dujail. It was home to many Shia Muslims, a community Saddam's Sunni-led regime often viewed with suspicion. This was during the Iran-Iraq War. Shia resistance groups were accused of secretly supporting Iran. Tensions were high. Trust was low. That day, members of an underground Shia group decided to strike. As Saddam's motorcade approached, gunfire erupted. Bullets tore through the air. His bodyguards moved quickly, shielding him from the attack. The shooting lasted only minutes. When it ended, Saddam was uninjured, not even scratched. But in his mind, This was an act that could not go unpunished. His response was swift and merciless. Within hours, security forces swept through Dujail like a storm. Homes were raided without warning. Doors were kicked in. Men, women, and children were dragged out into the streets. Some of the children were barely old enough to walk. Families were separated on the spot. Mothers cried out as their sons were taken away. Fathers were pulled from their homes. No one knew where they were being taken. No one was given explanations. Those arrested were thrown into overcrowded prisons. The conditions were brutal. Interrogations began immediately. Beatings were common. Electric shocks were used to break people down. Food was scarce. Water was rationed. Prisoners were left to suffer in the heat. Months later, the regime staged trials. But these were not real trials. There were no lawyers to defend the accused. There was no real chance to present evidence. The verdicts had already been decided before anyone entered the courtroom. 148 men and boys were condemned to death. Some were just teenagers. They were executed and buried in unmarked graves. Their families were never told where the bodies were taken. But Saddam's revenge didn't end with the executions. Dujail's farmland and orchards were deliberately destroyed. For a farming town, this was more than punishment. It was slow death. The land was Dujail's lifeline. Without it, families had no food, no income, no future. The attack that had lasted mere minutes had now condemned an entire town to years of suffering. This was the crime Saddam would stand trial for. This was the case the judges believed they could prove beyond any doubt. The evidence was strong. The witnesses were still alive. And the world was watching. Saddam's trial was tense and dangerous from the very beginning. It was held in Baghdad inside a heavily guarded courtroom. Concrete walls surrounded the building. Barbed wire topped every fence. Armed guards stood at every entrance. The judges, lawyers, and witnesses lived under constant threat. They knew their lives were at risk simply for being involved. Armed escorts followed them everywhere. Some traveled in unmarked vehicles. Others changed their routes daily. The precautions weren't enough. Several people connected to the trial were killed. Defense lawyers were targeted. Some were shot in the street. Others were attacked in their homes. The message was clear. Even participating in this trial could cost you your life. Despite the danger, the proceedings were broadcast on television. Iraqis across the country watched closely. In homes, cafes, and shops, people gathered around screens to see what would happen. For months, Saddam argued with the judges. He shouted in court. He refused to recognize their authority. He claimed the trial was illegal, that the court had no right to judge him. But on November 5, 2006, the courtroom in Baghdad fell silent before the judge spoke. The decision was made. Saddam Hussein was found guilty of crimes against humanity. The charges included the killings, torture, and forced displacement of hundreds of people in the town of Dujail. His punishment was death by hanging. He was not alone in his sentencing. Two other men also faced the same fate. One was Barzan Ibrahim al-Tikriti, Saddam's half-brother and former intelligence chief. He had long been feared for running brutal security operations across Iraq. The other was Awad Hamid al-Bandar, the chief judge of the Revolutionary Court. He had approved the mass executions in Dujail. The news spread across Iraq within minutes. In Shiite neighborhoods, where many had suffered under Saddam's rule for decades, crowds poured into the streets. They waved flags. They fired guns into the air in celebration. For them, this was justice finally served after years of fear, disappearances, and mass graves. They remembered the chemical attacks. They remembered relatives who had vanished and never returned. They remembered living in constant terror. Now, the man responsible would pay. But in Sunni areas, the reaction was completely different. In Saddam's hometown of Tikrit and across the western provinces, angry protests broke out. People chanted his name. They waved his picture high above their heads. They accused the trial of being unfair, politically motivated, and driven by sectarian revenge. To them, Saddam wasn't just a dictator. He was a symbol of Sunni power in Iraq. His execution felt like another step toward their community's loss and humiliation in the new Iraq. At that time, the country was already being torn apart by sectarian violence. Bombings happened almost daily. Shootings between Sunni and Shiite militias were constant. Kidnappings were routine. The streets of Baghdad had become a war zone. The verdict didn't just close a chapter. It poured gasoline on an already raging fire. Tensions climbed even higher. There were fears across the country that Saddam's execution could trigger even more bloodshed. That neighborhood would erupt. That the fragile peace, if it could even be called that, would shatter completely. Despite these risks, Iraq's new government made its position clear. They were strongly supported by the United States, and they wanted the sentence carried out as soon as possible. They didn't want to wait. They didn't want political pressure to build. They didn't want Saddam's loyalists to have time to organize any rescue attempt or large-scale protest. The plan was to move fast, to avoid giving anyone a chance to delay the execution, to end the matter once and for all. The Iraqi High Tribunal had already decided Saddam would be executed before the year 2006 came to an end. For many people, both inside and outside Iraq, the speed of this decision was shocking. Under Iraqi law, once a person's final appeal was denied, the execution had to take place within 30 days. There was no option to delay beyond that.